Hi, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Have you ever felt all at sea? You know what that means? I'll read a definition off of the internet for you in a minute, all at sea. But this is just a little lead into what I'm going to be talking about today. It's actually a book review of sorts and a few other reflections. So what does all at sea mean? Let's just have a look on sea here. If you look it up, where does the expression all at sea come from? The phrase at sea or all at sea has a nautical source. Before modern navigational systems, when a ship was at sea, it was out of sight of land and therefore in a dangerous, uncertain position. So to be all at sea can be a bit lost, uncertain, dangerous, not knowing what decision to make, which way to go. So that's a little bit of a definition of what my title is all about today, all at sea. But I'm going to be talking about an incident that happened in my own life. In fact, just getting back to being all at sea, I guess I've been retired about 13 years now, but a lot of my working life, I felt like I was all at sea. There were a few jobs that I did over the years and many years spent in the Commonwealth public sector in Australia, Commonwealth government sector. There are a few jobs that I had where I felt I wasn't all at sea. I was pretty competent and doing a good job and well regarded. There are lots of other jobs I did where I didn't feel like that. I might have given a different impression to others, but I didn't feel like that at all about how I was performing and what I was doing. I never had a problem with dealing with people and interacting with people, but I used to have a lot of problem as I got older with memory and all sorts of things, trying to deal with complex situations in the working life. So I was a bit all at sea myself several times. But there was a time in my life at one stage when I was going pretty well. And I wasn't all at sea. I was in a job that I liked and I was making my own in the workplace. And one day out of the blue, this guy who was a manager in one of the sections in the department that I worked in, he bumped into me in the corridor one day, I think, and he said, "Oh, Jeff," he said, "I've really been noticing what you're doing in the workplace," and these aren't his exact words, and been quite intrigued and impressed with how you're going about things. I'd like to know a bit more about what that's all about. Can we have a talk one day? And I was a bit taken aback. I thought, oh, what's that all about? Goodness me, here's someone been making some conclusions about me. So anyway, I said, okay, well, why don't we just meet in your office in the lunch hour, because he had an office. I was in an open space situation myself. But so I met with him in the lunch hour, and he said much the same as what I was just outlining to you. And he wanted to know where my motivation came from to do the things I was doing and where my drive came from. And along those lines, what made me tick, in other words. So I was a bit taken aback. And I think I had this book in my bag, but I basically stuttered and stammered a little bit. He's a nice guy, but I got a bit taken aback by such a direct question to me. I'd never had anyone approach me like that before. Anyway, I said, well, actually, it's because of my Christian faith. Turns out I found out that he was also a Christian and involved in a church. But I said, I don't know how to actually describe that. I said, but I've been reading this book, and I must have had the book with me, or maybe I brought it back and gave it to him on a second time, but I've been reading this book. And I said, if I lend it to you, that's probably got the answers to all the questions you're asking me in an indirect way, I guess, which is what I was implying. So I lent him the book. And later on, he gave me the book back and said, that was quite helpful. Thank you for that. And we never really had much more conversation after that. And then probably about a year later, he left the organisation anyway. So I lost contact with him. But it was an interesting little incident in my life. So you might say, well, what was the book that you lent this gentleman? And what's that got to do with being all at sea? Well, I wasn't all at sea at the time. I was going pretty well in the workplace, although later on I was a bit all at sea. But the book that I lent him was this little one here. And it is called With Christ at Sea by Frank T. Bullen. And you might say, well, who on earth is Frank T. Bullen and what's that all about? And before I read a little bit from the preface of this, I'll just read a bit on the internet about Frank Bullen. I found this book in a second-hand op shop of some sort. It says Frank Thomas Bullen was born April the 5th, 1857 and died on March the 1st, 1915. British author and novelist, was born of poor parents in Paddington, London on the 5th of April, 1857 and was educated for a few years at a dame school at Westbourne School, Paddington. At the age of 9, his aunt, who was his guardian, died. He then left school and took up work as an errand boy. In 1869, he went to sea and travelled to all parts of the world in various capacities, including that of second mate of the Harbinger and chief mate of the Day Dawn under Captain John R. H. Ward. In 1879, when she was dismasted and disabled. Having spent 15 years of his life at sea since the tender age of 12, he would later describe the hardships of his early life. And he said this, I've been beaten by a lad as big again as myself, and only a Frenchman interfered on my behalf. So a bit like the Good Samaritan story, I suppose. Those were the days when boys in gaudy colliers or East Coast fishing smacks were often beaten to insanity and jumped overboard or were done to death in a truly savage fashion. And all that was necessary was to account for their non-returning was a line in the log to the effect that they'd been washed or had fallen overboard. And anyway, to cut a long story short, he became a Christian man, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in his introduction to this book. And he wrote several books. Probably the most famous one, which I've never actually read yet, is called The Cruise of the Cachalot, Round the World After Sperm Whales. And then he's got all these other books here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, probably about 20 books at least. No, maybe 35 or something, all about his life at sea. And this particular one that we're talking about today was written in 1900. And the reason I gave it to my friend was because I drew some parallels with what this young man was going through in the rough and tumble of life at sea as a young person and trying to grapple with all the different personalities that were there, how to do what he was allocated to do, how to avoid the corruption and the perils of life at sea that befell the ordinary seaman and the young seaman when they went to sea. So my idea was that I found a lot of inspiration in this book about how to live the Christian life in the workplace. I could see some parallels. Maybe if you actually read the book, you'll find out why I was thinking like that. In fact, I'm going to put a link underneath where you can actually read the book online, the whole book online, which you might find interesting. See if you can draw the same parallels. But just to whet your appetite, and I'm not going to say too much more about this, it's a bit of a book review, and encouraging you to read it. With Christ at Sea by Frank T. Bullen, and it's out of copyright now, I understand, these days, so there's no problem with me reading it and violating YouTube. Potter and Staunton, publisher, London. And I read from the preface. And this makes me think a little bit about, you know, what am I doing when I do all this stuff that I do on YouTube? It may be objected by many who read these lines that there is a great deal too much of the ego in them. That's what I'm always worried about. There's too much of me and not enough about other people, and especially about my God. So he said that there is a great deal too much of the ego in them. If so, I can assure the objectors that I sympathise with them deeply. That is my feeling exactly. But when you come to think of it, apart from the fact that I was requested to put my experiences of religious life at sea in this personal form, there really seems to have been no help for it unless I had set up a fictitious personage and given him my real experiences. Excuse me. This would have been pleasanter for me, no doubt, would have saved me from many sarcastic remarks, but it would, I fear, have defeated the object for which I was asked to write. I confess I am hopeful about the future of this little book, more so than the circumstances would warrant, perhaps. Certainly much more so than I have ever been before, much more so than I have ever been before with my other works. And for this reason, works of religious fiction abound. And when you go into a Christian bookshop these days, I get put off because there is so much religious fiction. I thought, I want the real thing, not the fiction. And that's why it's better to be in the Bible than necessarily reading stories about people who are fallible. We're all fallible, and they can be say wonderful stories about themselves, but then they can crash, and you can find out they're disgraced later on. So Christian fiction leaves me a little bit to be desired at times. I think there's a place for it. Anyway, he said they are popular, in many instances deservedly so, but they are felt to be fiction and are not accepted as real pictures of everyday life. In this regard, I have tried, with what ability and experience I have been able to gather, to give a plain, real picture of religious life at sea. I feel deeply that my picture is imperfect, very imperfect, for who can turn his own heart inside out for his fellow men's inspection without being suspected of posing, insincerity, or some other such striving after effect, much less rightly appraise the motives and actions of his shipmates? In other words, who was he to judge the actions of his shipmates? But one can at least try to be simple, truthful, and direct. One can refuse to be ashamed to own himself a friend of Jesus Christ, or to avow himself a firm believer in the efficacy, I never can work that word out, efficacy of prayer for amelioration of all the ills of life. Another big word, isn't it? Lastly, it will be noticed that names and dates are given most sparingly, grudgingly. The reason for this is, I think, obvious. I do not fear libel actions, but I do dread giving unnecessary pain. He didn't want to upset other people who might see their name in here. I'll read a little bit from the introduction, and then I'll let you to do your own research and follow up on this book and see whether, if you are still in the workplace and you're struggling and you want to be a Christian at work and to be a Christian influence at work, and you're trying to cope with all the pressures, see if this book helps you as the same way I found it helping me at the time and why I recommended it to my friend. I'll just read a little bit from the introduction. I won't go too far, and then I'll sign off. So, with the most hearty desire to plunge forthwith into, you've got to remember this was written in 1900, to plunge forthwith into the heart of my subject, I am compelled to admit the necessity of a few preliminary remarks. For otherwise the question would at once arise, under what influence did this man fall at that most plastic time of life when the young mind first awakens? We do have a time in our life when our mind is pretty plastic, isn't it? And can be influenced in all sorts of directions. All readers who take an interest in that most important of all subjects, the rise and progress of godliness in the human soul, are properly most curious to know when, where, and how it was that any particular soul under discussion first began to feel the craving after God. To say that no two of such cases are exactly similar would be to utter an obvious platitude, and yet there are vast numbers of otherwise intelligent people who believe in machine-made Christians. Interesting phrase, isn't it? Therefore, it seems well. That means, I think what he's saying is they are made Christians who appear to be following a formula and made to a formula. We don't all necessarily fit the same formula, do we? I'll just go back to the start of that line that I was reading. Therefore, it seems well to remind them that there can be no such thing as a mechanical Christian, using the name in its reasonable sense. Mechanical religionists there are in abundance. But the very essence of Christianity is its spirituality, as distinguished from mere mechanism, I would add, going through the learned procedures. In my own case, my earliest recollections of religion are indissolubly, I'll just leave that word out. My earliest recollections of religion are bound up with three things. First of all, being taught by my aunt, who brought me up from infancy to the age of 8.5 years, to kneel at my bedside and say my prayers. Next, at the age of 4, my surreptitious reading of Paradise Lost. There's one from a blast from the past. And lastly, regular attendance at the Lock Chapel in the Harrow Road, where at a ludicrously early age, I became one of the choir on its first institution. You can tell we don't read all these words all that often, do we? I don't anyway, or say them. Now, of these 3 early memories, the first requires no comment, yet I dare to say that it was the most important of all, an early acquiring of the habit of prayer, even though it be only formal, must be one of the greatest benefits that a human being can receive. And whereas in my own case, it is accomplished by an earnest endeavour on the part of the teacher to make the young mind grasp the mighty fact of the existence of a friend able to do anything for the asker, and never more please than when being asked confidently for favours quite outside of any human power to grant. Its value as a factor in true life is quite beyond estimate. But my dear aunt was, although intensely evangelical, a rigid formalist. In other words, she was pretty black and white. To her mind, the fear of God was of more importance than the love of God. He, the Almighty One, was not to be approached familiarly or with familiarity. Set forms and attitudes were as necessary as unwavering faith, in order that prayers should be heard. And although this was more implied than expressed, answer to prayer was quite a minor consideration. The great thing was the saying of the prayers, the repetition of certain words got by heart in a reverent and orderly way. He must not be troubled with requests. God must not be troubled with requests for such temporal matters as payment of the rent when work was slack, or helping over a difficult task, whether lesson to work. Grace was what he must always be petitioned for, and I did not know what grace was for many years after. And we must always remember that if it were not for gentle Jesus coming between us and God, we should not only never be heard, but for our sins we should be punished with such terrible things, such that they could only be summed up in one comprehensive word: hell. How is it that I remember all these points so clearly? I do not know. I am aware that the child's memory is normally of a wonderful tenacity, but there may have been another sufficient reason. My aunt was an old maid, and she had an intense horror of the foulness of the streets, so although we were very poor, I was never allowed out to play. Fortunately, we had a large garden attached to the little house in Desborough Terrace, now Marlborough Street, Harrow Head, where all my early years were spent, so that my health never suffered from close confinement. But I grew up with a habit of providing my own company, holding long conversations with myself aloud, and since the principal things of interest in my life were more or less connected with religion, that subject was almost always the theme of my solitary discussions. So I suppose it became inevitable that all I heard upon the subject should be stamped upon my memory, so much so that even today, at any moment, I can reproduce for myself a mental picture of my aunt with spectacles on, solemnly reading her big Bible in our prim little parlour, with its horsehair-covered chairs, the old mahogany table with a curious irregular split running right across it, into which I used to drop pins and wonder whether they had gone, and the fatal Brussels carpet, threadbare in places, pervading the whole floor. I saw pervading for once, I remember it being taken up. I came suddenly into the room ignorant of what had happened, and was horrified. The place was foreign. Its very atmosphere was changed. I could read on and on and on. It's a fascinating book. He speaks very descriptively and uses a few big words that you'll get the hang of it if you read them. But it's a very inspiring book. I found it very inspiring. And he goes on and shows all the trials and tribulations, his victories and his failings in life at sea, and his growing, I suppose, as a Christian, which is something that comes through on me. That the Christian life is a process of going from the start to become mature in Christ. Doesn't mean you know everything, but it means you just keep learning and keep going. So there you go. If you're all at sea at the moment, why not turn to him and see if you can get a bit more security in your life and not feel so worried about everything and experience some of that grace that was just mentioned there. It's a great read, and I hope you find that interesting. And I'll put some links underneath to, or a link underneath where you can read the whole book in full, which is really wonderful. So thanks again for watching and listening. Like if you like, subscribe if you wish, and I'll see you next time. And I better turn this off because my little cat is meowing outside the door and wants attention. Probably wants something to eat. I'll see you later.